So, the ACLU's silence on racialized policing in Florida, huh? It's something that's been on the minds of a lot of folks lately. The American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, has long stood as a vanguard in the fight for civil rights, with a storied history of defending free speech, due process, and equal protection under the law. But in recent years, especially down here in Florida, a growing chorus of civil rights advocates and community activists have started to wonder if maybe the ACLU has strayed from its founding mission. At the center of all this criticism is the organization's perceived reluctance to investigate or intervene in mounting allegations of racist misconduct by law enforcement agencies across the state. This troubling trend, honestly, raises a pressing question. Has the ACLU in Florida been infiltrated, ideologically compromised, or co-opted in a way that stifles its role as a defender of the marginalized? Florida has seen a surge in racially charged incidents involving law enforcement, from questionable traffic stops in minority communities to the excessive use of force disproportionately targeting Black and Latino residents. Community watchdogs, grassroots organizations, and local journalists have documented numerous cases where racial profiling and systemic abuse appear to be not just tolerated, but embedded in institutional practice. And yet, in stark contrast to its historic posture, the ACLU's Florida chapter has been conspicuously absent in spearheading legal challenges or public advocacy related to these incidents. One possible explanation for this silence is internal infiltration, not necessarily by bad actors in the dramatic sense, but through the more subtle and insidious mechanisms of political influence and institutional capture. Over the past decade, several nonprofits and advocacy groups have faced pressure, both overt and, kind of subtle, to temper their critiques of law enforcement in order to preserve funding, maintain partnerships with government agencies, or protect their broader policy agendas. In this context, infiltration doesn't necessarily mean a hostile takeover, but rather a drift caused by strategic compromise and political realignment. There are also growing concerns about leadership and staffing within civil rights organizations, becoming more aligned with centrist or establishment political ideologies that prioritize policy reform over direct confrontation with systemic racism. In Florida, some critics argue that the ACLU's leadership has become increasingly focused on issues like voting rights and LGBTQ+ protections, which are crucial in their own right, while downplaying the urgency of racial justice in policing. This shift in focus, whether deliberate or incidental, can result in a selective form of advocacy that leaves some of the most vulnerable communities without a powerful legal ally. Furthermore, the increasing bureaucratization of large advocacy organizations may limit their capacity to respond to grassroots concerns. As the ACLU grows in size and scope, its ability to remain agile and responsive to local crises diminishes. The prioritization of national campaigns and headline-friendly litigation can overshadow the on-the-ground struggles that don't always make the front page but devastate communities nonetheless. In cities like Tampa, Jacksonville, and Miami, families of victims of police brutality often report receiving more support from local community groups than from well-funded national organizations. It's also important to consider the broader political climate in Florida. With the state's leadership leaning heavily toward law and order rhetoric and implementing legislation aimed at curbing protests and restricting diversity initiatives, any organization that challenges police authority risks retaliation, whether that's political, financial, or legal. In this environment, the silence of the ACLU may reflect a calculated retreat rather than a principled stand. However, if the ACLU in Florida has indeed compromised its stance due to infiltration, political pressure, or internal drift, the consequences are profound. It signals to law enforcement agencies that civil liberties violations may go unchallenged. It disillusions communities that have historically relied on the ACLU for protection, and it erodes public confidence in the very institutions designed to safeguard constitutional rights. Ultimately, the ACLU's legacy is not one of caution, but of courage. To remain faithful to that legacy, its Florida chapter must re-examine its priorities and confront the uncomfortable realities of racial injustice in policing. Whether the cause of inaction is infiltration, fear, or simple misalignment, silence in the face of systemic racism is complicity. If the ACLU does not lead the fight, then others must rise to demand the justice that Florida's marginalized communities so desperately need.